Welcome to Diverse and Inclusive Leaders, the show where I interview the most inspirational and thought-provoking leaders of today and unearth their unique stories of diversity and inclusion to help inspire, educate and motivate others to make the world a better place. Today, I am delighted to be joined by the phenomenal Julia Streets. Julia is a champion of fintech and female entrepreneurship, innovation, equality, and diversity and inclusion. She incorporated her business, Streets Consulting, the business development, marketing, communications consultancy. And since then, her and her team have advised a wide variety of international firms in the field of fintech, capital markets and payment innovation, where they offer specialist technology advice, including blockchain, artificial intelligence, cyber, and many, many more things. Julia has been listed multiple times in Brummel magazines, otherwise known as the city's little black book, recognized 3 times, in fact, as one of their 30 inspirational women influencers, inspirational women entrepreneurs, and inspirational women on boards. She's regularly listed on various other publications and called upon to host and MC many industry and public events. She's also authored her own book, and in addition to that is an after-dinner speaker and, interestingly, a stand-up comedian, which works very nicely, not only with the work that she does, but also around the humorous side and the emotional intelligence work that she does in addition. She's proud to serve as a trustee of the charity Street Child and is also a fellow of the British American Project, the Transatlantic Leadership Fellowship. Wow, I feel exhausted from just looking through all of the accolades, Julia. It's a pleasure to have you on the show. How are you?
I'm really well, thank you. Really, really well. So thank you. Yeah, thank you for inviting me on.
Thank you so much for being here. And it feels many worlds away since I last tracked you down, busy as ever in the centre of London. So obviously it's all very much a virtual world these days. So tell me, and everyone who is listening in to the show today, a little bit about what you've been up to of late, what's going on in the world of Julia, and how did you come to be where you are today?
Well, so right now in lockdown, it's very, very interesting time for us actually as a business, because when I set it up 13 years ago, I decided to make my business entirely virtual. So everybody works at home, and that meant that I could tap into a really interesting talent pool, which is largely, not entirely, but largely working mothers who have this constant tension between wanting to be at home with family and various kind of considerations around that, and then, well, versus being dragged into physical spaces, particularly in the city and in Canary Wharf. So actually, by having a completely virtual business model, it means that, of course, we have consultants all over the UK. I mentioned a lot of them are working mothers. They're not entirely. Some of them are working fathers. Some of them also caregivers for elderly relatives, and also have other interests as well. And it means that you can find incredible talent that doesn't necessarily sit on your doorstep, and also offer a very cost-effective business model for early stage businesses. And across a spectrum of our clients, some of them are the world's biggest financial institutions, and some of them are at the real sharp end of innovation, early stage startup companies, so who are very budget sensitive. So for us, actually, it's weird because there's no change. We've always worked like this. So actually, we're having a very, very good time, I'm delighted to say. I think a lot of people are looking for advice that comes in different shapes and forms. And 13 years, actually, we've never looked for a client. All our work comes in by recommendation, and right now we have a really healthy pipeline of new business coming in. So that's really good. The other big thing I've been thinking about is diversity and inclusion. So about 2.5 years ago, I was standing, as you do, at the House of Commons, listening to corporates, particularly in the city, talk about their commitment to diversity and inclusion, how D&I is in their DNA. And then you mentioned I'm a stand-up comedian, you mentioned I'm a host. So I meet some incredible people who are doing amazing things in the world of D&I, who are focused on feeding the female pipeline. I think of We Are the City, it's an incredible initiative that is all about finding rising talent. The work of the 30% Club and Women on Boards, And we also look at right the way across the spectrum that is diversity and inclusion. So I was asking myself, well, why on one hand, where there are some amazing initiatives that are really feeding the pipeline, right the way across the spectrum that is diversity and inclusion. So we talk about, I mean, there I particularly talked about gender, but think LGBT, and I'm a gay woman in the city. I always say I spent 20 years of my career trying not to be asked the question, what did I do at the weekend? Because I was convinced that coming out was going to destroy my career. So LGBT, thinking about obviously ethnic minority representation, race, oh my goodness, particularly right now. And then also thinking about age, thinking about cognitive disability, thinking about disability. We've been talking about apprenticeships, we've been talking about introverted leadership. So I started a podcast about 2.5 years ago called...
I love your podcast.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. It's called Diversity Podcast, all about diversity and inclusion in financial services. But we've had literally sort of tens of thousands of listeners all over the world. So actually, of late, I've been focused on the question of race. And we actually paused the entire schedule in order to do an extended episode, particularly around race and Black Lives Matter. And I'm a bit worried, actually, that I think it's a flash in the pan moment. It's a discussion that everybody jumped on of late. And actually, we're very committed to making sure that this conversation about race does not dissolve over the summer, and really thinking about what organizations should be doing and how they can help tackle some of the questions around institutional racism.
Thank you so much for sharing, Julia. And as always, full of energy, phenomenally busy, doing so much great work. I absolutely concur with you when it comes to Black Lives Matter. Let us all collectively not allow this to be a fleeting moment in history, but let us use this to actually truly accelerate what can actually be done to drive meaningful, long-term, sustainable change. You mentioned previously, and I hope you don't mind me picking up on this, but you so kindly shared a glimmer of vulnerability there around your personal story and dreading being asked what you did at the weekend. And this is so curious to me, because when I first met you, and I followed you for a long time before I eventually tracked you down in London, and you're such a successful powerhouse of a businesswoman that, to me, from the outside looking in, it almost seems peculiar or strange that you could actually be somewhat nervous or have that feeling of dread about discussing matters within your personal life, because you feel, to me, so very open and welcoming. And perhaps that's just me, but I wondered, for those who clearly are in the workplace and maybe haven't come out yet, or do have still those feelings of this is a taboo subject, therefore it can't be discussed, it might ruin my career, etc. I wonder, how did you manage through that personal journey? Because it'd be great to share with those who are listening in and perhaps feeling a lot of similarities between your journey and where they are.
It is very interesting. So I think the first thing is that it's all very much a personal choice. And on one hand, I was being encouraged by many in the LGBT community to come out. And on the other hand, I was looking at my work environment and thinking, I don't think this is a good idea. I'm being slightly binary about it, but it was pretty black and white in my mind. At the time I worked on a trading floor. I worked in the city and did not see many role models, if any, at all. And for me, I was on a very aggressive, fast-track career journey and was convinced, absolutely convinced, that this would actually either destroy my career or it certainly wouldn't help it. What is fascinating now is how much the world has changed. And it just gives me such deep-seated joy to watch organizations. And I interview leaders across the industry now who are coming out, and organizations who are allies to LGBT initiatives. And when we say LGBT, I just want to be crystal clear that we also talk about Q and I. So this is all about basically the entire spectrum of how people identify within the gay and lesbian, transgender community. And That really, really matters. What really encourages me at the moment is that those leaders who understand the value of diversity and inclusion, this isn't a nice to have conversation. This is a commercial imperative conversation. You know, there's so much data that will demonstrate that actually, if you have more diverse workforces, your productivity is improved. It will affect your bottom line, but also it means you can attract better talent. And so therefore, by having people in their organization who are comfortable with how they identify and how they present at work makes an enormous difference. And to me, I'd say it gives me enormous hope to see how that has changed. However, you know, there are many considerations around that. We must always remember that there is this slight conundrum between wanting to see data of improvement versus the reality of people's personal identity and how they want to present at work. So we have to remember there are human beings at the heart of this. The second is how people identify has changed. And it's really fascinating. So I just had a really interesting discussion for Lesbian Visibility Week, sort of back in April, thinking about how the language of LGBT has changed. So for example, the use of the word queer, and also some people presenting as being pansexual as opposed to identifying as bisexual or gay, or whatever language you want to choose. And also remembering that age and demographic really impacts people's personal stories. So particularly in your organization, if you do have people of a certain age, maybe of my age, and I've just turned 50, don't mind saying, proudly turning 50, by the way, because I am owning who I am, like there's no tomorrow. But if you look at the different demographics of different age groups, different people have different comfort levels of talking about their personal journeys and also owning language. So you see a lot of the younger generations come through and they are owning the word queer. But actually, if you look at people who are in their 50s and their 60s, queer has a connotation. And some of the negative connotations about queer bashing, etc. So it's a really, really fascinating discussion. I would say I've really embraced myself personally, partly by being involved with the podcast and asking and meeting so many inspiring people, is to really kind of get into, I think language is fascinating. I think the use of language, particularly around race, and also, right the way across diversity and inclusion. And I think as human beings, we're quite nervous about needing perfect language. And so going into, I would encourage every listener to go, look, if you're not comfortable with what language you should be using around any aspect of D&I, the answer is ask the question. Like, get in and talk to your communities and your networks about the type of language you should be using, because it makes a massive difference. And by the way, enlightened leaders get that joke.
It does indeed make a huge difference, the language. And I think you're very right in the comfort that people feel, especially when talking about things like race and personal things around sexuality. And a lot of the challenges that I found, particularly from CEOs and often the C-suite who may be more seasoned in their experience within the corporate world, they're worried about perhaps being vilified for saying the wrong thing. And that is what holds them back a huge amount of the time. But as you quite rightly say, asking the question, I think, remembering that we are all humans at the end of the day, we all have beating hearts and souls. And if it comes from a good place where you are genuinely curious, actually, usually there never are any vilified kind of repercussions that we might worry there could be. Actually, it's simply not knowing and wanting not to offend.
And if I could just add one thing to that, which is, first of all, nobody's ever going to have a problem with the fact that you're asking the questions, and really listen to what comes back. And the big thing that I'm picking up at the moment is that the use of the expression BAME is too much of a label on too broad a community. Mm-hmm. It is a very easy label to put on. It's one that somebody has adopted and organizations have adopted. And actually that needs to be looked at and considered very carefully. And in your organization, if you're thinking about, okay, so what should we do about it? Ask your community.
I could not agree more. And it's funny because we were doing a Dial Lounge on this very subject. It was all about going beyond BAME, and that this is almost, and we had a joke about it and said, well, it covers a plethora of sins, because actually, I would think of myself as Oriental, but in one sense, quite white. I was adopted by wonderful white British parents. Do I feel as Chinese as those who are, in Hong Kong or China? Probably not. There's lots of intersectionalities going on there, but also my black friends and brown friends as well from all different areas were all lumped into the same bucket, so to speak. And so where you look at what happens, to your point on these generational differences and the world of diversity, inclusion, and belonging, it's living, breathing, sleeping, it's growing, it's changing all the time. We must keep up to date with that. And I think that there is, the future will hold many diversities within diversities within diversities, and so on and so forth. But you mentioned an interesting piece there around the generations and what you've seen over the many years of not only LGBTQ plus and adding different letters onto that, but I wonder, was there a pivotal time in your career and perhaps in your personal life where you thought, right, that's it, I'm going to be myself now, and I don't care what anyone thinks? Now, there's a lot of talk about bringing your full self to work, in inverted commas. And, to a degree, perhaps that's overused a little at the moment. But I think it is, it's very, very key, and certainly something which lots of organizations are talking about right now. In reality, bringing your true self to work isn't always the easiest thing in the world. And I wondered, was there a pivotal moment in your life and career that you thought, right, the switch has flipped now and I'm just going to go for it?
It's a really interesting question. It's a really interesting question, because actually I don't think there really was. I think there was just a momentum. There was definitely a momentum of particularly setting up my own business, but then even in the beginning of a business, you want to get various pieces in place in order to set up a rock steady business. And I think even at the time I was like, I don't want to do anything to rock or to impact the ability to run a company and set up a company and make that successful. So you begin to look at what are all the things that could potentially take away from that. What do I want to come out? I don't think I do. But then, of course, you start doing business and you start building business with clients. And I've always been very obsessive about, do business with the people you really want to work with. And we have actually let clients go because our values have not been aligned. So then, therefore, don't underestimate how important it is that when you're building relationships with clients that, that you're open and honest about things. Now that's depending on the client, has come out in different ways, because sometimes it's mattered and sometimes it hasn't. And that's the thing, is it's a judgment call or whatever you need. And then, of course, every year something sort of changes, like starting the podcast. It really never genuinely, on hindsight, I think this is crazy, but it never genuinely occurred to me that when I started doing this podcast about diversity and inclusion, because I had so many questions, I'm like, I have to start a podcast, that I'd actually ever have to really come out on it. And then all of a sudden I was, doing a whole session series, because actually we've done many, many episodes about LGBTQI, and go, oh, I should probably talk about my own story, and go, oh, how do I feel about that? And having a conversation with my wife and going, are we comfortable with this? And going, yeah, yes, we are. Well, of course we are, because, role models matter. And I never had quite seen myself in a role model in that way. But then it's like, well, yes, of course. I mean, it's just madness not to. And then actually that in and of itself has gained some momentum.
Absolutely.
And to own that and really kind of appreciate it as well.
I love that you are sharing your story, and I just love the power of storytelling. I think it's often underestimated, but it can really have that wonderful snowball effect. And some of the best examples I've seen are chief executives and senior leaders like yourself sharing that courageous vulnerability almost of what sits behind the skin level and what makes them up as a human being, and not just them in the boardroom doing what they do best necessarily. But you find through that power of storytelling, others start to open up, others start to feel comfortable then to share their own stories. And you have this really kind of beautiful, organic piece where people are really organically becoming more of themselves, and it starts to peter through the various orifices of the organization, which I just think is phenomenal. Now, I must ask.
I just wonder if I could just jump in with one quick comment there. Well, it's interesting, because I think one thing that is often sort of underestimated is that how people actually come out every single day. And so, for example, I Every time I have a new client, essentially I'm coming out. Every meeting I go to, essentially in some way, shape or form, I have to ask myself the question, am I coming out? And also, even in terms of talking to the media, is to what degree do I want to talk about my sexuality? And I think a lot of people do forget, actually, with LGBT communities, is that for some people, I'm 100% happy, and for other people, they feel every single day when they walk into a meeting, some way, shape or form, are they having to present themselves and essentially having to come out. And it is often underappreciated, the mental processes that people have to go through every single day.
Has that got easier as time gone on, or has there ever been, even now, times where you think,
Oh yeah, no, it happens all the time. So even last week, I was doing an interview with one of the leading trade publications about women in capital markets, and I took an active decision to talk about my sexuality at the end because of I'm feeling now kind of being a role model. However, I wouldn't say that every community in my life is very comfortable with me doing that. I still have, I don't want to reflect on them at all, but I have aging parents, and their journey with my story is one that I can't underestimate. So, these are all considerations that come into play. Also, every time you check into a hotel, you're having to basically come out to somebody, depending on how you check into a hotel. So, these are all the kind of considerations that go on all the time.
Fascinating. Thank you very much for sharing, Julia. And I must ask about the comedy. You've obviously got a great sense of humour, and I know you were kind enough when we first met to share with me this story around the Edinburgh Festival and everything like that. I wonder whether you'd be so kind as to talk a little bit about some of the work that you've done in the comedy arena, and also potentially how that plays out, because I imagine that's a great conversation starter within business, and perhaps that's really helped with development of relationships potentially.
Yeah, well, so it all began because too many people to ignore had said to me, have you thought about stand-up comedy? In corporate presentations and throughout kind of my career. And then basically I was global head of communications for the technology business of the New York Stock Exchange. So I had this intergalactic job. I worked 2 days a week in Paris. And when I came out of that job, I basically decided to take a bit of a breather. So I've been on this fast track career. I was probably 36 at the time, about that. And I just thought, I just need to take a break, and didn't know what I wanted to do next. The phone was ringing and I was like, no, I'm going to wait. And I was watching a friend of mine who's a cabaret singer. I was sitting in a little cabaret club and I just had this bolt of lightning moment, which was, I have to do stand-up comedy and I have to do it now. If I don't do it now, I will turn 70 and regret it. I would have missed my opportunity. So literally the next morning, I booked myself, having never done stand-up before, a show at the Edinburgh Fringe, which is, if anybody's ever been. So this is also the days before apps, which would tell you where you go and you can book your shows through your phone. Basically, there are about 40,000 performers and 8,500 shows over the space of 3 weeks. And you have to get your crowd in. You have to deliver a show and you have to sell. And you have to send people down the Royal Mile to the box office to go and queue to go and see your show. So that's how it all began. And to be honest, I wasn't great, but I learned an enormous amount along the way. And I knew there was something in it. So then I basically honed my material. I then took it on the road and I did a few regional festivals and sold out. I then brought it into the city and sold out. Ended up doing the Comedy Store. I've gigged with, the greats of John Cleese and Sally Phillips and all manner of different comedy things. But what I did was I kept it very separate from the business, because just as I was doing that, the business was taking off. And I was thinking, actually, because I listened to the wrong people who said to me, actually, you need to pick. You can be a businesswoman or a comedian, but you can't be both. And they were wrong. Because for about 2 years, I kept them separate. And then I realized that when you bring them together, that's when the magic happens. So you kindly mentioned about the work I'm doing as a trustee of a charity called Street Child. And I did a big gig in the city. And I invited Mrs. Moneypenny, who is the FT, or was then the FT columnist of the Weekend FT. And I said to her, would you do your show and I'll produce it for you in front of my crowd in the city? And she looked at me and said, on one condition, you have to do the first act and I'll do the second. So essentially I came out as a comedian in front of my entire city audience, and it could have gone, it was a very fine line. It could have gone the wrong way. It didn't. And we raised a lot of money that night because actually people said to me, I'm a trader. I could trade millions in a day, but I could never do that. And then people started saying, well, actually, would you come and host our conference? And would you come and host our events and our awards? And so actually, even now in the digital age, next week, I'm hosting a massive Rising Stars awards ceremony. And it all now just kind of reveals itself in different ways. And I get booked to host largely industry conferences. So what's fascinating for that is it's the content that I love because of the day job. And it's the energy that I bring from what we've learned with comedy. But also what I'm now doing is I've got this program called Executive Shine, which is working with an award-winning stand-up comedian, teaching people how to present and sell and be very effective as communicators using stand-up skills. Because I think there's so much value to be had in stand-up comedy and it's changed my life, that actually it could change others too.
Mm-hmm. Julia, thank you so much for sharing. What an absolutely epic story. I have a huge amount of inspiration for, especially the comedy, I have to say, because the amount of work that goes into these routines. And I'm a massive fan of comedy. A friend of mine, Jimmy McGee, used to perform at the Comedy Club in London. I loved going down there and going to watch them. And I remember having chit chats with him and he was saying, oh, maybe I could be teaching corporates how to be standing up and present. And I think, where you talked there about this real kind of interesting juxtaposition where you're having to sell yourself, you're having to present, it's the bravest thing you can do to stand up and reveal your soul almost to everyone who is in the crowd, who I'm sure you're worrying about, what they're judging and this and that and the other. What a great thing to do. I mean, if you can do that, I bet you can absolutely feel you can do anything and take on the world.
And it has really interesting kind of physiological benefits. It's extraordinary. My heart rate has come down because of stand-up comedy. My stress levels have come down because you learn how to maintain your stress and your control. But this all comes down to and it's what you said earlier about storytelling. You have to be able to, as a comedian, you have to be able to tell good stories. Whether they're quick one-liners or whether they are, long, rambling, old wives' tale stories, is actually you have to hold an audience. And the skills that you learn from that through comedy are incredibly important. And also on podcasts like this, you have to be able to tell good stories.
Wow. I would love to do a stand-up piece one day.
Come to one of ours. I was going to say, come and join a coaching session. I mean, it's amazing. And we get feedback, people saying, literally, I was complimented by my bosses the next morning about how I ran that meeting, how I held that meeting, even how I contributed to that meeting, let alone, being a keynote speaker on a main stage or over a digital platform.
Do you know what, Julia? I might just do that. I'm signing
you up. I'm signing you up. That's not optional.
Deal. So before we run out of time today, I'd love to go into our quick fire lightning round. I'm going to give you about 30 seconds to answer each of the next questions before we wrap up for today. And firstly, I guess I'll start with something we've been talking about for the entire podcast, actually. What does diversity, inclusion and belonging mean to you personally?
It means being me. It absolutely means being me. It means I can get up every day, look myself in the mirror and finish the day, look at myself in the mirror going, I absolutely have been me today.
Great answer. Any secrets to success?
Gosh, good question. Always focus on value. So whatever you're doing, wherever you are in the food chain within an organization, wherever you are in your career journey, is always think about what value do you bring the organization and to your peers and also to your bosses. Because then that reflects out in terms of what your contribution you make, but also how you look after your clients as well. So really focus on what's the value. The other thing is also find the jobs that nobody wants to do and have a really good go at them. You may not be perfect because you can learn on the way. Perfection is a great enemy. Embrace imperfection and recognize that by being imperfect, we're all learning.
Excellent advice. And have you had any particular heroes or sheroes throughout your career, or indeed even any books or podcasts that you're listening to? Because we love knowledge here on this podcast. We always share this afterwards in our show notes.
Well, biggest hero ever, Victoria Wood. Yeah, and for me, watching somebody on TV, it's about role models actually, who went out on stage on her own. I saw her live many, many, many times with no warm up and could hold the Royal Albert Hall. Was just extraordinary and so humble and so self kind of effacing and so brilliant. What a wordsmith. So that's the first one. But that's from the comedy kind of point of view. In the more business, or actually, let's talk about the diversity piece. You know, let's return to this question about race. And the book that I'm particularly reading at the moment is Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race by Reni Eddo-Lodge. I haven't finished it. I can't proclaim to haven't finished it. I'm right in the middle of a massive build project at the moment, so I don't have a great deal of spare time. But it is a book I'm committed to reading, particularly around this conversation about race. It is a fascinating read.
Excellent. And finally, I wonder if you could go back in time and talk to the young Julia. Maybe you're about to go out onto that trading floor, or it's even earlier than that. Is there any advice that you give to the younger Julia who's about to embark on what is now pretty epic career?
You're going to be all right. You're going to be all right. And love every minute, no matter what it is, no matter what challenge you take on. Just love every minute.
Thank you so much, Julia. It's been an absolute pleasure having you on the show today.
It's been wonderful. Thank you so much. Again, thank you for asking me. It's been a great time.
It's been a joy. And by way of my usual summary, my goodness, have there been a huge amount of learning points. We've covered so much. I'm enthused now to start with stand-up comedy, and hopefully many others also will look to follow in your path. But I think some of the real key learning points for me are very much around being yourself and actually being brave enough to really look deep inside yourself and to look at the bigger picture. Because actually, when you talk about and you shared that coming out, you know, could be every single day. You know, and we look at all the different complexities that make us up as human beings and look at what we are sharing with the external world. Actually, that takes braveness and that takes courage. And although authenticity is perhaps the word that's overused these days, actually being truly authentic and being confident and brave enough to be you, despite knowing that there could be failures and there could be others that will judge, but doing it anyway, I think is such a great piece that has come out of this. I love the emphasis on role models. I think anyone who is listening in, role models, if you don't have them within your organizations, go and seek them. Role models, real models, those that are willing to talk openly and share their stories. Storytelling is key. And it can be, as we've learned today, the real tip of the iceberg that then allows the snowball to tumble down and for this to organically grow in a positive way, because diversity, inclusion and belonging, as we all know, is a living, breathing, sleeping piece and needs constant care and love and attention. And it takes all of us to come on board on that journey to make great things happen. My name is Leila Mackenzie-Dallas, and you've been listening to the Diverse and Inclusive Leaders podcast show. We're with you every week. You've been listening to the phenomenal Julia Streets today. If you missed anything at all on the podcast, don't worry. It'll all be in the show notes at the end of today's show. So we will put in there the key learning pieces, and you can check out all the great work that Julia is doing as well. Visit us at www.dialglobal.org/podcast, and we'll look forward to seeing you again very, very soon. Thank you so much for watching the Diverse and Inclusive Leaders podcast. Please do feel free to hit the like button below, or if you'd like to receive future notifications, do ping the notification bell here at the side. If you're interested in the audio version only, you can find it on the following streaming platforms. Any extra info and descriptions will be in the links below. Look forward to seeing you soon.